sealed plane, 30 passengers, and a mid-flight murder that seems impossible. But can you figure out who committed this chilling crime? Or is Hercule Poirot the only one who can uncover the truth? The sleek silver aircraft Prometheus 23 sat gleaming on the runway, its engines humming with anticipation. The passengers, a mix of high society and ordinary travelers, boarded the flight from Paris to London, blissfully unaware that for one among them, this would be their final journey. Inside the luxurious first-class cabin, a hush of polite conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses filled the air. A businessman in a crisp suit adjusted his cufflinks. A crime novelist absent-mindedly jotted down ideas in a leather-bound notebook. A glamorous actress tilted her compact mirror, checking her reflection with a practiced pout. Seated near the window, meticulously dressed in his signature gray suit and polished shoes, was Hercule Poirot, the famed Belgian detective. His mustache, perfectly waxed, twitched slightly as he observed his fellow passengers with quiet amusement. Across the aisle sat Madame Giselle, a woman known only to a select unfortunate few. A moneylender of the most dangerous sort, she dealt in secrets as much as she did in loans. Many owed her some in money, others in silence. Dressed in dark silk, her sharp eyes flickered over the passengers before she leaned back, seemingly at ease. But for a woman like Giselle, enemies lurked in every shadow. As the plane ascended into the clouds, time passed in quiet luxury. Stewardesses moved gracefully between the aisles, offering refreshments. A game of bridge was casually discussed among the passengers. Poirot, ever the observer, sipped his coffee, noting the small interactions, the whispered conversations, the stolen glances. Something in the air felt off. Then, somewhere over the English Channel, it happened. A soft, almost imperceptible gasp escaped a flight attendant's lips as she leaned over to check on a passenger who hadn't responded to the dinner service. A moment later, the tray in her hands clattered to the floor, sending silverware skidding under the seats. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin as heads turned toward the source of the disturbance. The stewardess stood frozen, her face pale, her trembling fingers clutching the edge of the seat. Madame Giselle was slumped unnaturally, her head lolled to one side. Poirot's sharp eyes locked onto the scene. Something wasn't right. The woman's expression was too still, her body eerily rigid. And then he saw it. A tiny, almost invisible mark on her neck. Poirot leaned forward, a terrible realization dawning upon him. This was no natural death. And the most chilling part, the killer was still on the plane. The impossible murder. For a fleeting moment, silence clung to the cabin like an oppressive fog. Then, the murmurs swelled whispers turning into gasps, gasps into sharp, frantic voices. A woman was dead, on a moving plane, with no sign of struggle. The flight attendant, pale and shaken, stepped back as passengers craned their necks, eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and dread. Some recoiled, others whispered among themselves. Poirot, however, did not move. He remained still, his sharp gaze fixed on Madame Giselle's lifeless form. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His trained eyes swept over her elegant dress, her lifeless hands resting unnaturally on her lap, the faint, almost undetectable discoloration around her lips. A clue only visible to those who knew what to look for. Then his gaze dropped to the floor near her seat, and there, barely noticeable against the plush carpet, was something that sent a cold chill down his spine. A tiny, nearly invisible dart. Poirot bent down, retrieving it with the utmost care. It was minuscule, no longer than a sewing needle, its tip barely glistening with residue. Poison. A silent, efficient killer. But how had it been delivered? There was no gun, no blowpipe in sight, and no one had seen anything. The weight of the mystery pressed down on the cabin like an unspoken curse. Passengers were accounted for. The doors were locked. They were thousands of feet in the air, trapped together, and yet someone had just committed an impossible murder. The biggest questions loomed, casting a sinister shadow over everyone aboard. How had the murder been committed in plain sight? Had the killer struck in the chaos of the flight, hidden in the lull of conversation? Where did the poisoned dart come from? It wasn't the kind of weapon someone could just casually carry. This was methodical, planned, professionally executed. And most chilling of all was the killer planning to strike again. Poirot turned to the passengers, his voice calm but laced with authority. Mesdames et messieurs, I regret to inform you, this was no ordinary death. This was murder. And the killer is among us. A stunned silence followed. Then, a sharp, piercing click. Poirot turned just in time to see a Manon of the passengers slowly reaching into his coat pocket. And in that moment, a terrible thought seized Poirot's mind. What if the killer wasn't done yet? The suspects. Everyone has a secret. A murder in midair. A locked room mystery at 30,000 feet. And 4 passengers who, on the surface, seemed like strangers but each carried a secret they'd rather take to the grave. Poirot observed them, his keen eyes flitting over their faces, searching for the cracks in their masks. Murderers always slip up eventually. And in this cabin there was no place to run. Daniel Clancy, the crime novelist, who knew too much. A wiry man with ink-stained fingers and restless eyes, Clancy sat with a notebook open on his lap, a fountain pen poised above the pages. He had been writing when the murder happened, or so he claimed. Astonishing, isn't it? He murmured, almost to himself. A murder, right here, under everyone's nose. Almost poetic. He sounded more fascinated than horrified. Clancy was a crime writer, celebrated for crafting intricate whodunits. But Poirot found something unsettling about the way he leaned forward, his lips twitching as if savoring the unfolding mystery. Had Clancy finally taken his fictional expertise to reality? Had he committed the perfect murder, just to see if Poirot could solve it? Lady Horbury, the glamorous star with a tainted past. She sat in her plush seat, legs elegantly crossed, her gloved fingers trembling ever so slightly as she sipped champagne. On the surface, she was every inch the poised socialite dressed in the latest Parisian fashion, diamonds glittering at her throat. But Poirot had seen many like her before. The type who hid desperation behind rouge and fine fabrics. Lady Horbury was once Madame Giselle's client, a woman known for loaning money to the rich when their fortunes turned sour. And when Madame Giselle collected debts, she did not ask twice. Had Lady Horbury's glamorous life been nothing but a crumbling illusion? Had Madame Giselle threatened to expose her, forcing her to take drastic action? As Poirot studied her, she met his gaze, and for just a fraction of a second, her polished facade cracked. Dr. Bryant, the healer who could kill. The good doctor sat upright, his expression stoic, too calm, too controlled. A medical genius, highly respected in his field. But Poirot knew something the others didn't. Dr. Bryant was an expert in toxins. The poisoned dart, so precise, so lethal, could have only been the work of someone who understood the science of death. When Poirot mentioned poison, a shadow flickered in Dr. Bryant's eyes. Was it surprise or recognition? Jane Grey, the innocent girl, with a dangerous secret. The young air hostess stood near the aisle, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her eyes darted nervously across the cabin, as if trying to remember every passenger's movements. To most, she was just a stewardess, polite, efficient, invisible. But Poirot had learned long ago. The most unassuming people often held the deepest secrets. She was the closest to the crime scene. She saw everything, perhaps too much. And yet, she was afraid. Not of the murder. Of something else. Something or someone this plane had shaken her to her core. And then, it happened. A loud, shattering sound ripped through the tension. A wine glass slipped from Lady Horbury's hand, smashing onto the floor. But that was not what made Poirot's pulse quicken. A single piece of paper fluttered from her lap. Poirot bent down and retrieved it. His breath hitched as he read the hastily scribbled words. I saw who did it, and if they know I saw, I won't make it to London alive. Who wrote the note? Who had seen the killer? And more importantly, who else on this plane was about to die? The suspects. Everyone has a secret. A murder in midair. A locked room mystery at 30,000 feet. And 4 passengers who, on the surface, seemed like strangers but each carried a secret they'd rather take to the grave. Poirot observed them, his keen eyes flitting over their faces, searching for the cracks in their masks. Murderers always slip up eventually, and in this cabin there was no place to run. Daniel Clancy, the crime novelist, who knew too much. A wiry man with ink-stained fingers and restless eyes, Clancy sat with a notebook open on his lap, a fountain pen poised above the pages. He had been writing when the murder happened, or so he claimed. "Astonishing, isn't it?" he murmured, almost to himself. "A murder, right here, under everyone's nose. Almost poetic." He sounded more fascinated than horrified. Clancy was a crime writer, celebrated for crafting intricate whodunits. But Poirot found something unsettling about the way he leaned forward, his lips twitching as if savoring the unfolding mystery. Had Clancy finally taken his fictional expertise to reality? Had he committed the perfect murder just to see if Poirot could solve it? Lady Horbury, the glamorous star with a tainted past. She sat in her plush seat, legs elegantly crossed, her gloved fingers trembling ever so slightly as she sipped champagne. On the surface, she was every inch the poised socialite dressed in the latest Parisian fashion, diamonds glittering at her throat. But Poirot had seen many like her before. The type who hid desperation behind rouge and fine fabrics. Lady Horbury was once Madame Giselle's client, a woman known for loaning money to the rich when their fortunes turned sour. And when Madame Giselle collected debts, she did not ask twice. Had Lady Horbury's glamorous life been nothing but a crumbling illusion? Had Madame Giselle threatened to expose her, forcing her to take drastic action? As Poirot studied her, she met his gaze and for just a fraction of a second, her polished facade cracked. Dr. Bryant, the healer who could kill. The good doctor sat upright, his expression stoic, too calm, too controlled. A medical genius, highly respected in his field. But Poirot knew something the others didn't. Dr. Bryant was an expert in toxins. The poisoned dart so precise, so lethal could have only been the work of someone who understood the science of death. When Poirot mentioned poison, a shadow flickered in Dr. Bryant's eyes. Was it surprise or recognition? Jane Grey, the innocent girl with a dangerous secret. The young air hostess stood near the aisle, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her eyes darted nervously across the cabin, as if trying to remember every passenger's movements. To most, she was just a stewardess, polite, efficient, invisible. But Poirot had learned long ago, the most unassuming people often held the deepest secrets. She was the closest to the crime scene. She saw everything, perhaps too much. And yet, she was afraid, not of the murder, of something else. Something or someone this plane had shaken her to her core. And then, it happened. A loud, shattering sound ripped through the tension. A wine glass slipped from Lady Horbury's hand, smashing onto the floor. But that was not what made Poirot's pulse quicken. A single piece of paper fluttered from her lap. Poirot bent down and retrieved it. His breath hitched as he read the hastily scribbled words. "I saw who did it, and if they know I saw, I won't make it to London alive." Who wrote the note? Who had seen the killer? And more importantly, who else on this plane was about to die? The plane touches down at Croydon Airport with an unsettling screech as its wheels scrape against the tarmac. The moment it halts, the air crackles with tension. Authorities rush in, sealing the aircraft and preventing anyone from leaving. A murder has been committed mid-flight, and the situation is already spiraling into chaos. Hercule Poirot, with his sharp gaze and meticulous mind, steps aboard the plane. He surveys the scene, taking in every detail with his usual precision. The passengers are visibly shaken, whispering anxiously to one another. But Poirot knows the answers lie hidden within this very aircraft. This crime, so bold and executed in plain sight, strikes him as particularly intriguing. The puzzle is already beginning to form in his mind as he walks down the narrow aisle, his eyes flicking from one person to the next, taking in every detail. His first breakthrough comes when he examines the space under one of the seats. There, nestled in the shadows, is a small but deadly object, a blowpipe, expertly concealed. Poirot picks it up delicately, running his fingers over its smooth surface, admiring its craftsmanship. It's been used recently, he notes, and the dart that should be attached to it is missing, presumably the weapon used in the murder. Ah, Monday Dieu. A method as old as time, he mutters, his eyes scanning the passengers. One of them, he suspects, had used this blowpipe. But when? And who is hiding behind that carefully constructed mask of innocence? He can almost feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on him as he ponders the dark corners of the plane. Next, Poirot's attention is drawn to Madame Giselle's handbag, which the investigators have now rifled through. The stewardess, looking nervous, reveals that something critical is missing: a letter. The letter, according to the stewardess, was meant to be delivered to someone in London, but it's nowhere to be found. The absence of the letter is chilling. Was it stolen? Poirot asks, his voice tinged with suspicion. The stewardess nods hesitantly. Yes, Monsieur Poirot. It was meant for someone specific. A personal letter, but it's gone now. Gone. Stolen, perhaps, by the very person who stands to gain from its contents being hidden. Poirot's mind spins with the implications. The letter, if found, might reveal the motive here, perhaps the identity of the murderer. The more Poirot considers it, the more he senses that this missing piece holds the key to the entire case. Was it taken by the murderer to protect a secret, or was it hidden to prevent a dangerous revelation from reaching its intended recipient? Poirot's investigation takes him deeper into the heart of the mystery as he begins to study the passengers. Most of them are visibly distraught, whispering among themselves, casting furtive glances at the authorities. But one passenger stands out, a man sitting with unnerving calm. His movements are deliberate, too smooth, too controlled. He seems unaffected by the tension in the air, and his hands remain perfectly still in his lap. A master of disguise. Poirot's eyes narrow. Could this man be the murderer? Or perhaps someone running from a much larger, far more dangerous secret? His little gray cells begin working at full speed, but before he can piece together the next step in his investigation, the head investigator approaches, his face grim. "We've found something else," he says, his voice heavy with dread. Poirot follows him swiftly to the back of the plane, where a small compartment near the galley has been pried open. Inside, hidden beneath a pile of blankets, lies a discovery that sends a chill down Poirot's spine. Another dart. But this one is different. It hasn't been used. Beside it, however, is something far more chilling: a handkerchief, stained with fresh blood. Poirot's mind races. Could there have been another target? A second victim waiting to be silenced? The implications of this discovery are staggering. Before he can voice his suspicions, a blood-curdling scream echoes through the plane, followed by chaos. One of the passengers has collapsed, and the panic in the cabin grows. Poirot's pulse quickens. The murderer is still aboard. The question now is, who is the next target? With every passing moment, the web of intrigue tightens, and Poirot knows that every step forward brings him closer to unraveling a deadly conspiracy. The flight may have landed, but the mystery is far from over. The killer is still lurking, and Poirot is about to discover just how far they're willing to go. What secret lies behind the murder? And who will survive the deadly game of cat and mouse? The final twist: unmasking the killer. The tension in the room is thick, almost suffocating. The air crackles with nervous energy as Hercule Poirot surveys the faces before him. The passengers, the crew, the suspects, each of them shifting in their seats, some glancing at one another, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Outside, the rain lashes against the windows, as if the heavens themselves are bracing for what is about to be revealed. Poirot, ever the master of theatrics, folds his hands neatly before him and exhales slowly. "Mesdames et messieurs," he begins, his voice calm but laced with authority. The time has come to reveal the truth. A nervous cough from the back, a bead of sweat rolling down a trembling forehead. Somewhere a clock ticks steadily, counting down to the moment of revelation. The web of lies. Everyone is a suspect. At first, Poirot continues, it seemed obvious. Madame Giselle, a woman with many enemies, was killed using a poison dart fired from a blowpipe. A method silent, deadly, and cunning. And what does the evidence suggest? A missing letter, a hidden identity, a passenger too calm in the face of murder. His gaze sweeps across the room, watching for reactions. A flinch, a twitch, a flicker of recognition. Many of you believed the killer was one among you, but no, the true villain was far cleverer than you imagined. They manipulated, they deceived, and most importantly, Poirot's voice lowers, his eyes darkening. They counted on all of you blaming the wrong person. Someone lets out a sharp breath. A hand grips the armrest a little too tightly. The false leads, clues that misled everyone. Poirot paces the room. The blowpipe, a deliberate plant. The missing letter, stolen to throw us off. And the passenger with a hidden identity. A mere smuggler, running from another crime altogether. A red herring. Gasps ripple through the group. Someone mutters under their breath. The shadows in the room seem to grow deeper as Poirot's words cut through the noise like a blade. No, Miami, the truth is far more insidious. Poirot stops suddenly, his voice like a whip, because the real murderer is sitting among us right now. A deathly silence. The shocking reveal. The true killer unmasked. Poirot turns sharply and points. You, madame. A gasp. The accused, a woman. Her carefully composed face suddenly falters. A tremor runs through her hands as she clutches at the fabric of her dress. Moi, c'est impossible, she protests, but her voice lacks conviction. Poirot presses forward, relentless. You thought no one would suspect you, a quiet presence, blending into the background. But I saw it, a moment of hesitation when the blowpipe was found. A flicker of recognition when the missing letter was mentioned. And most importantly, the one thing you could not hide, the scent of jasmine lingering on the handkerchief, soaked in blood. The room erupts. Someone gasps. Another recoils. The woman's face drains of color. The motive, revenge, greed, or a buried secret. Why would I kill her? She whispers, voice barely audible. Poirot tilts his head, his little gray cells working faster than ever. Ah, but that is the true question, is it not? A murder is never just about the method, it is about the why. He takes a deep breath. Madame Giselle was not just a moneylender. She knew secrets, dark, dangerous secrets, and she knew yours, did she not? The accused's fingers tighten into fists. Her eyes dart toward the door, searching for escape. She knew something about you, Poirot continues, his voice now soft, coaxing. Something you were willing to kill for. Was it blackmail, a hidden scandal? Or perhaps, he pauses, eyes narrowing, a betrayal from long ago, one you could never forgive. The accused lets out a broken laugh. The tension in the room snaps like a bowstring. You think you know everything, Poirot, she whispers, her voice cold now. But you don't know what it's like to live in fear. She stands suddenly. Yes, I killed her, and I would do it again. A collective gasp. Shocked murmurs. Someone grips their chest. Another turns away. Poirot's eyes soften, but only for a moment. But, madam, you made a mistake, and now justice will have its way. The cliffhanger, a chilling twist. The authorities move in, placing her under arrest. The case is closed. Or is it? Just as Poirot is about to leave the room, a small, almost imperceptible noise catches his ear. A whisper. It wasn't just me, the woman breathes, her lips curling into a chilling smile. You still haven't found them, the one who helped me. Poirot stops. The shadows seem darker now. The storm outside rages on. There is still another killer out there, watching, waiting. The room, once filled with the fervor of Poirot's brilliant deduction, now hums with a quieter, more ominous energy. The murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, and the rustling of clothing are the only sounds breaking the heavy silence. The accused, who only moments ago had worn the mask of composure, now sits broken. Her posture is a picture of defeat, shoulders hunched, as if she were carrying an invisible weight far heavier than her frame could bear. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, are the only remnants of the person she once was, now a hollow reflection of guilt. The officers, with their stern faces and unwavering authority, move towards her, their presence an undeniable force that drives home the irreversible nature of her fate. There's no turning back. No escape from justice. Poirot watches silently, his expression unreadable. He doesn't revel in the woman's downfall. Instead, he remains detached, his sharp mind already shifting beyond this moment, calculating the deeper, more intricate ripples of the crime. His gaze falls to the officers as they lead her away, his fingers steepled behind his back in the classic Poirot manner. Finally, with the faintest of sighs, he speaks, almost as if to himself. "Justice," he murmurs, the word almost philosophical. It is like a well-brewed tea bist served at the right temperature. The wry smile that crosses his lips is fleeting, barely noticeable. Yet it carries an air of wisdom, a knowingness that suggests Poirot's mind never truly rests, even when the case appears to be closed. As the tension in the room begins to lift, the passengers exhale in unison, a collective sigh of relief filling the space. The dread that had hung in the air like a suffocating fog slowly dissipates, replaced by a quiet sense of awe at having survived the nightmare. But while some are quick to shake their heads in disbelief, others exchange nervous, almost guilty glances, as though unsure whether they had narrowly escaped the grasp of death itself. "To think we were sitting next to a murderer all along," one woman murmurs, her voice a mixture of fear and awe. The realization seems to settle over the room like an uncomfortable weight. Some passengers still appear shaken, their minds unable to fully grasp the horror that had unfolded on this very plane. The crew, once visibly rattled by the events, now resumes their duties in a mechanical, almost detached manner. The suitcases are gathered, the final announcements are made, and the plane, which had once been a vessel of tension and terror, is slowly emptied. The sealed doors of the aircraft open with a hiss, revealing the world outside bright, indifferent, and untouched by the turmoil that had taken place in the skies. For them, it's just another day, while for the passengers, this journey will haunt them for years to come. They will never look at a flight the same way again. But Poirot does not move. He remains rooted to the spot, his gaze distant, unfocused, as though lost in a labyrinth of thoughts that others cannot see. His mind, always sharp, is still working, still dissecting the fragments of the case that refuse to fit into a neat, tidy box. Something feels off. Something lingers in the shadows of his mind. The murderer's last words echo through his thoughts like a whisper from a forgotten place. "You still haven't found them. The one who helped me." The words coil around his thoughts like a serpent, growing larger with every passing moment. Poirot feels a shiver travel down his spine. The case, so perfectly resolved, so neatly tied up, feels far from finished. A nagging sensation crawls under his skin, urging him to look deeper, to uncover what has been overlooked. His gaze drifts to his hand, where he still holds a seemingly insignificant object, a button. It had caught his eye earlier, but he had dismissed it, thinking it was a mere trifle, an afterthought. Now, in the quiet aftermath, it feels heavier in his palm, as though it holds a secret that is waiting to be unearthed. Poirot's lips tighten into a thin line as he mutters softly to himself, his voice low and contemplative. "Monday, Ami," he says. A clue ignored is like a shadow. It follows, it lingers, and when least expected, it returns. He pockets the button, his mind already racing, his instincts telling him that this small, seemingly insignificant piece of fabric is the key to something far darker. He steps into the cold London air, his eyes flicking to the horizon, a glint of knowing in his gaze. The storm outside, having raged through the night, now seems distant, but the storm within Poirot's mind is only just beginning. As the plane empties and the crowd disperses, the camera focuses on the passengers, each of them moving in their own direction, lost in their thoughts. But one figure remains still, watching, unnoticed by all. This person stands at the periphery of the crowd, their face obscured by the shadows, their eyes trained on the unfolding scene. A slight smile plays at the corners of their lips, a smile that is far too knowing, too satisfied. A gloved hand slips into their pocket, retrieving a second button identical to the one Poirot now holds. The camera zooms in on the button, its simple design betraying no hint of the sinister secrets it harbors. The realization hits Poirot like a bolt of lightning. The case isn't over. The true game is only just beginning. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows of London's labyrinthine streets, the real mastermind still watches, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The mystery is far from solved. In fact, it may have only just begun. A dead body in a locked room. The door sealed from the inside, and one final clue. A blood-stained stone. But how is this possible? The camera glides across a picturesque landscape as the blue train cuts through the rolling hills of the English countryside. The sun is beginning to set, casting an amber glow on the lush green fields outside. The train, a marvel of 1920s opulence, puffs its way along the tracks. Inside, the atmosphere is one of quiet luxury. The gleaming mahogany-paneled walls of the dining car gleam beneath the soft glow of the ornate chandeliers. The laughter and clink of silverware create a symphony of refinement as the passengers, dressed in their finest evening wear, sip champagne and converse in hushed tones. The camera moves smoothly between them, catching snippets of conversation, a mention of the weather, a soft laugh, a furtive glance exchanged between two passengers. The world inside the blue train is full of secrets, but it's all too polished, too perfect. It's almost too perfect. Among the passengers is Catherine, a striking woman in her late 20s. Her beauty is almost ethereal, framed by her delicate features and the soft waves of her dark hair. She is elegantly dressed in a rich blue gown, her laughter infectious but slightly guarded. Her eyes, though full of warmth, carry a flicker of something more. She holds a letter in her hand, its edges worn, as though it has been read over and over again. She's traveling to meet her fiancé, Paul, a man whose name carries weight, but whose true nature seems like a carefully guarded secret. Catherine's glance shifts to the window, her eyes scanning the passing countryside, but there's a momentary flicker of worry. She tucks the letter back into her bag with a subtle sigh, an action only the sharpest eyes might notice. There's more to her story than meets the eye, and the audience is already starting to wonder, who is Paul really? Why does Catherine seem so distant, despite her apparent wealth and beauty? Introduction of Hercule Poirot. As the passengers settle in for the evening, we cut to Hercule Poirot, sitting alone at a small table in the corner of the dining car. He is a striking figure, a man of meticulous appearance, with his perfectly groomed mustache and sharp eyes that seem to miss nothing. Poirot's presence is understated but commanding. He doesn't draw attention, yet there's an aura of quiet intelligence that seems to command respect without effort. Poirot is engaged in a calm conversation with Mr. Collier, a fellow traveler who is discussing the intricacies of fine wines. Poirot listens intently, his eyes twinkling with that familiar gleam of amusement, as if savoring the conversation more than the subject at hand. His responses are measured and polite, yet there's something almost mischievous in the way he handles Mr. Collier's every word, offering observations that seem a touch too precise, too knowing for a mere casual chat. The camera focuses on Poirot's subtle movements, the way he tilts his head, the small smile that curls at the corner of his lips as Mr. Collier misjudges a point. Poirot, ever the observer, has a knack for letting others reveal themselves without them realizing it. He's not just a man of action, but of profound psychological insight. Poirot's thoughts are never far from the center of his being, though. He glances across the room, his gaze briefly locking with Catherine's. She offers a polite smile, which Poirot returns with a small nod. There's no direct interaction between them, yet the moment lingers. Poirot doesn't miss a thing. At first glance, Poirot may appear to be just another distinguished traveler, but his very presence is unsettling. The audience knows, deep down, that wherever he is, something is about to happen, and it won't be what anyone expects. Tension under the surface. As Poirot continues his quiet conversation, there's a growing tension in the background. A couple of passengers exchange whispered words, their eyes flicking nervously between each other, and a sense of unease begins to settle in. Not everyone on this train is as they seem. Behind the polished exteriors, there are secrets, hidden motives, and something is about to go horribly wrong. The first sign of trouble. As the night falls and the stars twinkle outside, Catherine disappears from the dining car for a brief moment. Her absence goes unnoticed by most, but Poirot's eyes never stray too far from his surroundings. He subtly adjusts his seat, watching the door she exited from, the small flickers of movement drawing his attention. Something is off. He doesn't know what yet, but Poirot's instinct tells him it's only a matter of time before this seemingly peaceful journey turns into something much darker. The camera cuts back to the luxurious interior of the blue train, the silence now holding a subtle sense of dread. A dinner bell rings, but no one moves to get up. Not yet. The incident. It's late into the night, the soft murmur of the train's wheels a constant companion to the passengers' heavy silence. The luxurious dining car has emptied, the lingering clink of glasses fading into the distance. Catherine, her delicate form now wrapped in a rich sapphire blue robe, returns to her compartment, looking weary but content. Her thoughts are clearly elsewhere, but what lies behind that calm exterior is a heart full of secrets and unresolved tensions. Minutes pass. Suddenly, a sharp scream cuts through the silence, echoing down the corridor of the blue train. It's Catherine's voice. By the time the conductor reaches her compartment, it's too late. The door is locked from the inside. When it's finally opened, the scene that greets the eyes is horrifying. Catherine's lifeless body lies sprawled across the plush velvet carpet, her eyes wide open in a final, unspoken horror. The elegant necklace she wore, the one with the glimmering, priceless diamond, is gone. There's no sign of struggle, no broken windows or open doors, only the unmistakable sense of cold, calculated death. The other passengers are gathered outside, murmuring in confusion and shock, unable to comprehend what's occurred. But what they can't see, what they don't know, is that Catherine's murder isn't just about a stolen gem. There's something more sinister at play, something deeper beneath the surface. The police are called, but despite their best efforts, they're stumped. The train's crew, with their strict adherence to protocol, are unable to explain how a woman could have been murdered in a locked compartment. Who had access to her room? And why was the door locked from the inside? The evidence, or the lack of it, makes no sense. But Poirot knows better. Suspense building. Poirot steps into the scene with his usual poise, though there's a sharpness in his eyes that signals he's already at work. As the police bumble through their initial investigation, Poirot observes in silence, allowing the chaos to unfold around him. The camera focuses on him, his every glance, every subtle shift of his hand revealing that he is already piecing together the puzzle in his mind. His first observation is simple, but it's crucial. The lock on the door. It's unmarked, untouched. No signs of tampering. But Poirot knows something the others don't. The killer didn't need to break in. Whoever did this was already inside, and they were far closer than anyone could have imagined. Poirot begins to speak to the passengers, but not in a direct, accusatory way. His questions are subtle, layered. A raised eyebrow here, a seemingly innocent question there. He watches how they react. Who is too calm? Who seems nervous, but hides it behind a smile? There's no rush to make accusations, but the tension is palpable. As Poirot speaks, the shadows of doubt fall over every one of them. Mr. Collier, who had been so amiable at dinner, is now sweating nervously as Poirot asks about his whereabouts. Mrs. Van Zuylen, the widow, tries too hard to offer assistance, but her eyes flicker nervously when asked about her previous encounters with Catherine. The French Count, tall, dark, and brooding, gives off a subtle air of danger, as if he knows more than he's letting on. The quiet man in the corner, a passenger who spoke little during the evening, seems to be hiding behind his spectacles, his lips twitching slightly when asked the simplest of questions. Poirot knows that each of them is hiding something, but who among them has blood on their hands? The first twist. Poirot walks down the length of the corridor, his shoes clicking softly against the polished wood. The lights flicker briefly, casting eerie shadows. As he reaches the back of the train, something catches his eye, a scrap of paper, just barely visible beneath a rug. With a quick glance over his shoulder to ensure no one is watching, Poirot crouches down. He pulls the paper free, revealing an elegantly written note. The handwriting is familiar, Catherine's, but it's the words that cause Poirot's heart to skip a beat. Meet me in the compartment, midnight. There's something I must tell you. P. Paul, the fiancé. But why had Catherine left this cryptic note? And if she was meeting Paul, why did she not mention it to anyone? Was she trying to escape? Was Paul involved? And why was the note hidden here of all places? Poirot's mind races as he begins to piece together a theory. But something doesn't sit right. The presence of the note might be an accidental slip-up, or it could be a deliberate attempt to mislead. Was it planted? And if so, by whom? Cliffhanger. Poirot returns to the scene of the crime, his mind a flurry of theories, when the train enters a dark tunnel. The dim light flickers first once, then twice, casting a momentary darkness over the entire compartment. A low hum fills the air. Then, a blood-curdling scream echoes through the train. It's a shrill, desperate cry from one of the passengers. When the lights return, everything is eerily still. Poirot strides towards the source of the scream, only to be stopped by a sharp gasp from the conductor. In the middle of the floor, lying in plain view, a blood-stained handkerchief, small and embroidered with initials that match no one on the passenger list. But the real shock, it belongs to a person who hasn't been seen since the murder was discovered. Poirot stops in his tracks, the realization dawning on him like a storm cloud. The killer is still on board, and they are closer than anyone could imagine. With a slow, deliberate turn, Poirot looks at the gathered passengers. His voice, low but filled with weight, cuts through the room like a razor. I believe, my friends, the game has just begun. The next morning, as the blue train chugged through the dense mist of the English countryside, the mood was a stark contrast to the night before. Where once the passengers had been full of chatter, laughter, and the clinking of fine china, now a dense, uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Everyone aboard seemed to carry the same heavy knowledge. Catherine was dead, and someone among them was responsible. The murder had shattered the veneer of sophistication and luxury, leaving behind a thick fog of fear and suspicion. The police had already begun their investigations, but it was clear that they were in over their heads, struggling to make sense of the locked compartment and the vanishing jewelry. This was where Hercule Poirot, with his unmatched skill for deduction, would step in. His presence, though quiet, was commanding. He did not need to raise his voice or rush through his questions. His calm, methodical demeanor had a way of making people nervous, even when they didn't realize why. The detective had a knack for drawing out truths that others could only hint at, and in this case, every word, every glance would be crucial. The widow's secrets. Poirot began his rounds with Mrs. Van Zuylen, the widow who, at first glance, seemed to carry herself with all the elegance and poise one might expect from a woman of her wealth. She was dressed impeccably, her black lace dress and diamond-studded earrings barely betraying the sadness that had gripped her. She had entered the dining car earlier with an air of dignified grief, but beneath that mask, Poirot could already sense there was more. Mrs. Van Zuylen, like all the others, was no stranger to luxury. Her wealth was the result of years of marriage to a man whose fortune had been made in the bustling world of international shipping. But with her husband's death came a wave of rumors, and the way she spoke of him had always been vague, as if trying to mask something painful or perhaps shameful. Poirot, after a polite introduction, took a seat across from her, offering a glass of water. As she accepted, her hand trembled slightly, but she quickly regained composure, her lips curling into a forced smile. "Madame, if you do not mind," Poirot began, his voice smooth and polite but cutting with the sharpness of a blade. "I must ask you about your relationship with Miss Catherine." She stiffened at the mention of Catherine's name. The brief flicker of panic in her eyes was hardly noticeable, but Poirot had seen it, and it was enough. "It was cordial," she replied, her voice smooth but betraying an edge of hesitation. "We were acquaintances. A woman of her caliber, of her beauty, was always admired in society." Poirot nodded slowly, leaning forward. "But there was something more." "No," You and Miss Catherine were not just acquaintances, were you? Mrs. Van Zuylen faltered, her hand still clutching her glass a little too tightly. The truth had been exposed, at least partially. There was a secret, and Poirot was certain it was a love affair that no one had yet known about. Her nervousness was enough for Poirot to deduce that she had been far closer to Catherine than she was willing to admit. I had a friend, she said slowly. A gentleman, but that is no longer of consequence. She turned her gaze toward the window, as if searching for something in the endless expanse of countryside, and for a moment, Poirot considered pressing her further. But he knew that rushing would only drive her further into her shell. With a small smile, Poirot made his exit. There was a connection there, a relationship tangled with Catherine's untimely death, but the widow was not ready to confess it. Yet, the professor's eagerness. Poirot's next subject was the professor, a man of academic stature who had been on the train to attend a lecture on a subject far too dry to hold any real interest for Poirot, but one that made the professor appear well-regarded and respected in his field. He was a man of tall, thin stature, and his glasses perched precariously on his nose, giving him an appearance of perpetual absorption in his work. It was his eagerness to be involved that first drew Poirot's attention. The professor was the first to volunteer his assistance to the authorities, almost too willingly, too quickly. He offered suggestions to the police, gave his opinions on possible theories, and frequently checked the progress of their investigation, though he had no real authority to do so. His actions reeked of too much interest in the case, the kind of interest that suggested he had something to hide. Poirot's first question was simple. "Professor, tell me, where were you during the time of Miss Catherine's death?" The professor, as expected, answered without hesitation. "I was in my compartment, reading. I did not hear the scream. I was deep in thought." Poirot took careful note of the professor's precise words, particularly the way he emphasized, "deep in thought." It was too much, too rehearsed. There was no panic in his voice, no concern, just too much control for a man who had just been caught in a murder investigation. "Do you know, Professor?" Poirot asked casually. "I find it curious that you were so eager to offer your assistance. It is as if you knew this was coming." The professor's eyes flickered with the slightest hint of alarm, but it was quickly masked by a small, polite laugh. "Of course, I am simply trying to be helpful." But Poirot wasn't fooled. There was something more beneath the surface. The professor knew something, or perhaps had been involved in some way. Poirot's instincts told him to dig deeper into this man's past, into his research. There was a theory forming in Poirot's mind, a theory that hinged on one simple but crucial question. What did the professor know about Catherine's secret life? The French count's flamboyance. Poirot then turned to the French count, a man whose presence seemed as grand and extravagant as the jewelry he wore. He was always impeccably dressed, his mannerisms smooth and his charm endless. There was no denying his appeal. However, Poirot sensed something off about him, something that didn't sit right. The Count had already expressed his condolences to Mrs. Van Zuylen earlier in the evening, but Poirot had caught a fleeting glance shared between the two. It was not the look of mourners. No, this was something else, something more calculated, something more intentional. "Ah, Count," Poirot greeted him warmly, taking a seat at the small table near the lounge car. "Your travels seem to bring you to many interesting places." The Count smiled, eyes gleaming with a practiced charm. "Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, one must enjoy life, no?" "Of course," Poirot replied, "but tell me, your connections to Miss Catherine, were they professional, or was there something else?" The Count stiffened, his smile faltering for the briefest moment. "I do not know what you mean." Poirot didn't press immediately. Instead, he observed the Count's every movement, his hand brushing against his pocket, his lip curling ever so slightly as he attempted to adjust his collar. It was all too practiced. Poirot had learned long ago that too much confidence often hid a deeper insecurity. "I find it curious, Count," Poirot continued, "that a man of such means, such flamboyance, would be so concerned with something as simple as a woman's death. Is there a connection, something hidden?" The Count's eyes flashed with a glimmer of anger, before it was once again veiled with charm. I hardly know the woman. We exchanged pleasantries, but nothing more. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch. It was only when the Count was about to speak again that Poirot's gaze turned colder, his voice cutting through the tension. And yet, I have heard rumors, Count, that you may have more complicated connections than you care to admit. The rising tension. The discovery of the second diamond set off a chain reaction. Tensions exploded among the passengers, who were already on edge from the constant questioning. Whispers turned into angry accusations, and before long, the elegant dining car became a battlefield of words and distrust. Mrs. Van Zuylen was the first to lash out, accusing the professor of being involved in the crime, citing his eagerness to assist and his questionable ties to certain members of society. In turn, the professor accused the French Count, insinuating that his lifestyle, filled with expensive tastes and extravagant spending, was fueled by illicit dealings. The accusations were escalating, each passenger accusing another in an attempt to shift the blame from themselves. As the argument grew louder, two suspects, a man with a dark past and the charming but enigmatic Count, became physically entangled, their hands grasping at each other's throats, their faces twisted in rage. The commotion startled the other passengers, and the air was thick with fear and uncertainty. It seemed as if the murder was just the beginning of something far darker. Poirot remained calm, a picture of composure amidst the chaos. His sharp eyes flicked from one person to another, taking in every gesture, every glance, as the room fell silent, waiting for him to speak. "Murder is but one piece of the puzzle," he said softly, his voice cutting through the tension. "But remember, my friends, we are not dealing with a simple crime. This is a dangerous game, and some of you are playing it very well." The silence in the room was palpable, but Poirot wasn't done yet. He knew that the truth was close, but it would take every ounce of his brilliance to uncover it. Cliffhanger. Poirot had spent hours painstakingly piecing together the fragments of the case, his mind racing with every detail. His deductions had narrowed down the list of suspects, and with each passing moment, he could feel the truth just within his grasp. Yet, just as he was about to unveil the final piece, something unexpected happened. A sudden shadow fell across him, and Poirot turned to find himself staring down the barrel of a gun. A suspect, someone he hadn't fully suspected, stood there, the cold steel of the weapon aimed squarely at his chest. Time seemed to freeze. Poirot, ever the composed figure, stood utterly still, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the threat. The man was trembling, fearful, but determined. The gun wavered slightly in his hands, and the silence in the room was deafening. Poirot's voice broke the tension, calm and measured, as always. "The truth is closer than you think," he said, his gaze never leaving the man with the gun. "But can you trust your eyes?" Before the man could respond, the screen faded to black, leaving the audience on the edge of their seats, desperate to know who was pulling the strings behind this deadly game. Who would pull the trigger? Would Poirot's brilliant mind save him in time, or had he underestimated the danger lurking aboard the blue train? The reveal. The tension aboard the blue train was suffocating. The passengers, once mere strangers passing through the quiet countryside, now sat in a state of silent, eager anticipation. Each one of them knew that Poirot was close to uncovering the truth that had been buried beneath layers of deception, secrets, and lies. The final confrontation was imminent, and Poirot knew that this would be the moment when the mask would finally fall. The train came to a stop at a remote station, its wheels grinding to a halt with a sharp squeal that echoed through the stillness of the night. The dim glow of the station platform cast long shadows across the dining car, adding a chilling atmosphere to the impending showdown. Poirot, ever the picture of calm, stood at the center of the room, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the passengers, each one now nervous, guilty, or perhaps both. The final curtain was about to rise, and Poirot would reveal what none of them had seen coming. As the guests sat at the long, polished dining table, Poirot's voice rang out, slow and deliberate. "You have all told your stories, some of you more convincingly than others," he began, his eyes glinting with the subtle power of someone who was always one step ahead. But every story has its cracks. Every lie has its edge. He turned his gaze to Mrs. Van Zuylen, the wealthy widow, who had been so careful to hide her involvement, her secret affair with Catherine. You were not just acquaintances, were you? You had far more to hide than anyone knew, and your desperation to conceal the truth has been obvious from the start. The widow flinched but said nothing, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Poirot didn't need her to speak. He had already pieced together enough to know that she had motives far more complex than grief. Then his attention shifted to the professor, whose eagerness to assist had always struck Poirot as too calculated. Ah, but your eagerness to help did not come from a place of pure altruism. You knew more than you let on. A man of your background would not simply stand by while others bumbled through an investigation, would he? The professor swallowed hard, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table, but still he refused to speak. Poirot's gaze moved next to the French count, who had been attempting to hide his nervousness under layers of charm. And you, Count, your lifestyle was one of opulence and excess, but it was built on lies and deceit. Catherine was not just a casual acquaintance. She was a key player in your underworld dealings, and her death was nothing more than a calculated risk. A hushed murmur rippled through the room as Poirot laid the foundation of the truth. But he wasn't done yet. He stood tall, taking a step toward the center of the room. The passengers sat still, their eyes flicking nervously from one another. But Poirot's voice held them in place. You have all tried to cover your tracks. Each one of you has hidden something that could unravel the web of lies. But I assure you, the murder of Miss Catherine was not just the result of a robbery gone wrong. No, it was the final act in a long-running game of betrayal, a game you were all involved in. His eyes locked on each of them, one by one. And the one who pulled the trigger, he continued, is sitting among you. A cold silence filled the room as Poirot turned towards the back of the train. The tension was unbearable. The flickering candlelight danced off the walls, casting haunting shadows that seemed to whisper the truth. But who would break under the pressure first? Suddenly, Poirot turned sharply, his finger pointing to someone at the far end of the room. The air crackled with anticipation. You, he said, his voice firm, were the final piece in the puzzle. You thought you could escape, but the truth always catches up. As the passenger looked up, shock and fear in their eyes, the room fell completely still. Poirot had done it. He had unmasked the killer, but his final words lingered, sharp and commanding. The truth is never as simple as it seems, and yet, it is always right before our eyes. The culprit. The room was thick with tension, as Poirot's calm presence held sway over the gathered passengers. He had watched, listened, and quietly observed the shifting dynamics throughout the investigation. Now, in the final moments, everything came together. With a deliberate step forward, Poirot raised a hand, signaling that the time for guessing was over. He was about to reveal not just the identity of the murderer, but the true motive behind Catherine's death, a motive that would shake everyone to their core. As Poirot's gaze swept across the room, he turned his attention to Mrs. Van Zuylen, the widow who had become the focal point of suspicion. Her once graceful demeanor had crumbled under the pressure. Her involvement with Catherine had been too evident, her nervous fidgeting too revealing. But Poirot knew the truth was even darker than anyone had imagined. Mrs. Van Zuylen was not simply a heartbroken lover caught in a web of betrayal. She was part of something far more intricate, a network that had its reach in the highest echelons of power, far beyond the blue train. Poirot began speaking, his voice steady and unyielding, each word dropping like a hammer. Mrs. Van Zuylen, he began, pausing as he watched her stiffen. You were not merely a woman scorned. Your connection to Miss Catherine was deeper than any of you could fathom. What you failed to mention in your story was that Catherine was not just a woman caught in the throes of a forbidden romance. Poirot's eyes glinted as if savoring the revelation. She was an undercover agent, an agent involved in a high-stakes game of international espionage. And you, Mrs. Van Zuylen, were not just a lover, you were her handler. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath, as Poirot continued. You see, Catherine wasn't just traveling to meet a lover. She was transporting a blue diamond, Yes, but not just for its value. It was the key to unlocking a dangerous conspiracy involving illegal weapons trade, corrupt politicians, and an international syndicate with fingers in many pies. Catherine's task was clear: deliver the diamond, expose the criminals, and end their grip on power. But when you discovered her involvement, when you saw the danger she was courting, you chose to protect yourself. The shock was palpable. Mrs. Van Zuylen's face drained of color, her eyes darting to the other passengers, all of whom were now sitting in stunned silence. "You killed Catherine," Poirot said, his voice like a stone in the air. "Not out of jealousy, but to prevent her from exposing everything, to protect the conspiracy you were a part of. You thought that by eliminating her, you could escape the consequences of your actions, but you underestimated me." Poirot's words were sharp, each one a blade cutting through the facade of normalcy. But as he spoke, he knew that there was more to this. The truth was not as simple as a love affair gone wrong. Mrs. Van Zuylen was not just a murderer. She was part of a dangerous game that spanned continents. The Blue Diamond was the key to unlocking a massive international conspiracy, one that involved more than just a simple jewel theft. The conspiracy stretched far beyond the train, and it was this very train, the Blue Train itself, that had become a critical point in a dangerous smuggling operation. Poirot's voice softened, the atmosphere growing heavier with each word. But it wasn't just about Catherine's death, was it? No, it was about controlling the flow of information. You and your accomplices didn't just want the diamond. You wanted the secrets Catherine carried with her. Secrets that would tear apart a network of power and corruption that stretched across borders. The room was silent. Even the passengers who had once stood apart now seemed united in their confusion and horror. The realization that the murder was part of a larger, more sinister plot hit them like a freight train. Cliffhanger. As Poirot made his final deductions, it seemed as though the case had been wrapped up. The mystery of the Blue Diamond had been solved, the motive had been revealed, and Mrs. Van Zuylen was exposed as the murderer. But the weight of the moment was suddenly broken by a shift in the atmosphere, something no one could have predicted. In the shadows of the room, a mysterious figure stood, watching silently. This was no ordinary person. They were cloaked in the darkness, too far in the distance for anyone to make out clearly, but their presence was unmistakable. They watched Poirot with a look of cold calculation. A sudden sense of danger rippled through the dining car, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Poirot, his keen senses never missing a beat, glanced toward the figure. For the briefest moment, his expression faltered, an imperceptible change in his demeanor, just enough for the astute observer to catch. Then, with an almost imperceptible nod, Poirot returned his focus to Mrs. Van Zuylen. He knew what was happening. He knew this was only the beginning. The figure in the shadow seemed to disappear into the darkened corridor of the train, their identity still shrouded in mystery. But their message was clear. This wasn't the end. There were more forces at play. Poirot turned his gaze toward the camera, his face expressionless, but his eyes betraying a glint of recognition. He smiled, a subtle yet enigmatic smile, as if he were in on a secret that no one else could comprehend. "The truth, my friends, is now revealed," Poirot said, his voice smooth but tinged with something darker. "But remember this, while one mystery may have been solved, the game has only just begun." As the camera zoomed in on Poirot's inscrutable expression, the train's wheels began to click and groan again, a reminder that the journey was far from over. With one last, fleeting glance toward the shadows, Poirot slowly turned away, and the screen faded to black, leaving the audience in suspense, their hearts racing for what was to come next. A murder, suicide, or the perfect cover-up, a question from the past, haunts Poirot. But the answer is far deadlier than anyone imagined. The morning air was crisp, laced with the scent of damp earth and the promise of an early frost. In the heart of an idyllic English town, where cobbled streets wound like veins through the sleepy village, Hercule Poirot enjoyed the rare luxury of a peaceful stroll. The sun, weak yet hopeful, filtered through the amber canopy of autumn leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. His thoughts, often troubled by the weight of the world's mysteries, felt light for once, as if the quiet of the countryside had the power to calm even the sharpest of minds. But tranquility, as it often does, proved to be fleeting. A soft, hurried footstep broke the rhythm of his walk, and a familiar voice, strained and urgent, called out his name. Hercule, Hercule. Ariadne Oliver, the celebrated crime writer whose mind was as sharp as her wit, came running toward him, her face pale and drawn, a far cry from the usual lively energy that characterized her. Her normally vibrant eyes were clouded with a worry that instantly set Poirot's own senses on edge. "You must listen to me, Poirot," she said, her breath ragged from the effort of her brisk pace. Her voice trembled, barely concealing the underlying panic. "At a party last night, someone asked a most chilling question about the Ravenscrofts." Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed as he adjusted the angle of his hat. The Ravenscrofts, that name was a shadow that had haunted the town for years, their deaths long believed to be a tragic murder-suicide, the cause of which had been buried under a veil of silence. General Ravenscroft, a man of impeccable military honor, and his wife Margaret, who had once been the epitome of grace and beauty. A night of unimaginable horror, the truth of which had never fully surfaced. "Why now?" Poirot asked, his voice steady but his curiosity piqued. "After all these years, what more could possibly be uncovered about that which is long buried?" Ariadne shook her head, her fingers trembling slightly as she grasped Poirot's arm. "That's just it, Hercule. Someone in that room, someone who knew far too much, asked a question. A question that made my blood run cold. Was Margaret Ravenscroft truly killed by her husband? Or was there another, far darker truth hidden in the shadows?" Poirot's lips thinned. A question, not an accusation, but a question nonetheless. It was the spark that could reignite a fire long extinguished. The same fire that burned with unanswered truths and secrets best left alone. "There are whispers, Hercule," Ariadne continued, her voice soft but laden with fear. "Whispers that Margaret may have been murdered by someone else entirely. That the real killer has been walking among us all these years, undetected. The truth has been forgotten, but for how long?" A brief silence hung between them, thick with tension. Poirot's mind raced, turning over the possibilities, each more chilling than the last. And yet, despite the unsettling nature of it all, a part of him was intrigued. Ariadne was never one to entertain such notions lightly. If she believed there was something to this, Poirot had no choice but to follow. "But why now?" he asked again, his eyes scanning the landscape of the town as if the answer might be hidden in its quiet streets. Ariadne's eyes flickered with something Poirot could not quite place. "I don't know, Hercule," she whispered. "But I fear the past is coming back to haunt us, and if we don't act quickly, another shadow, one far darker than the first, may rise from the ashes of that forgotten tragedy." Poirot took a slow breath, his mind already working, formulating a plan as he met Ariadne's anxious gaze. "Then we must uncover this mystery before it is lost forever." He paused, watching the play of emotions cross her face, before he added with a faint, knowing smile, "And let us hope, for the sake of all concerned, that we do not uncover something we are not meant to know." Ariadne swallowed hard, her grip tightening on his arm. "Please, Hercule, before it's too late." The two of them stood there, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a storm on the horizon. Poirot knew that this was not just another case. This was a challenge, one that would unravel a thread long buried, revealing something that had been concealed for far too long. And as they walked toward the Ravenscroft estate, the town seemed to hold its breath, as if the very ground beneath their feet sensed the return of a past that had never truly been laid to rest. Cliffhanger. As Poirot and Ariadne approached the Ravenscroft estate, a sharp, chilling scream echoes through the distance. The mystery of the Ravenscrofts had just begun, but was it already too late? The Ravenscroft estate stood shrouded in an eerie stillness, the once grand mansion now draped in layers of ivy, its walls heavy with secrets long forgotten. The scent of damp earth mingled with the faint trace of decay as Hercule Poirot and Ariadne Oliver stood at the entrance, gazing at the silent ruins of a place once filled with laughter and life. As they crossed the threshold, the creaking of the old wooden doors echoed through the house, as if the very walls were protesting their return. The air inside was thick with dust, the light barely filtering through the cracked windows, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch toward them. "It's as though time has stopped here," Ariadne whispered, her voice barely a murmur, as if afraid to disturb the peace that had settled in the mansion. Poirot nodded, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, every forgotten corner. There was something unsettling about the silence, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to be uncovered. They moved deeper into the heart of the mansion, their footsteps muffled by the worn, faded carpets. In the drawing room, Poirot's eyes landed on an old photograph, framed and faded with age. Margaret Ravenscroft smiled in the picture, her beauty captured in a moment frozen in time. But beside her there was another woman identical in every way, Dorothea. Her face was an eerie mirror of Margaret's, but her eyes held a darkness, a hint of something that made Poirot's pulse quicken. "Two sisters," Ariadne murmured, peering over his shoulder. "But there's only ever been mention of Margaret, nothing about a twin." Poirot's brow furrowed as he studied the image. A twin, or a shadow. A twin who might have been lost, forgotten, or deliberately erased from history. Ariadne's hand fluttered to her lips. But why would she be erased? Before Poirot could answer, the sound of footsteps reached their ears, slow, deliberate, coming from the hall behind them. The housekeeper, a stooped woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, entered the room, her gaze wary but respectful. "Mr. Poirot, Miss Oliver," she said softly, her voice thick with the weight of years. "I trust you've come to learn the truth. It's a dangerous thing, you know, uncovering old ghosts." Poirot turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Ghosts, you say? You have heard whispers then, madame?" The housekeeper hesitated, glancing toward the shadows, as if fearful someone or something might be listening. Strange sounds, before the tragedy, whispers and laughter, in the dead of night. "I thought I was imagining things at first. But no, it wasn't just me. Others heard it too. And then, the screams. The sound of something terrible breaking." Ariadne's eyes widened. "The night of the tragedy." "Yes," the housekeeper replied, her voice trembling. It was as though the house was alive with something darker than just sorrow, something unnatural. Poirot remained silent for a moment, his mind piecing together the fragments. Whispers, laughter, and then screams, all before the supposed murder-suicide. There was something else lurking here, something hidden beneath the surface. "Tell me, madame," Poirot said, his voice calm but piercing. "Did anyone notice anything peculiar about Madame Ravenscroft before?" The housekeeper sighed, her gaze distant, as though she were trying to recall a memory locked away in the recesses of her mind. "Madame Margaret," she grew, strange, towards the end. Paranoid. She would sit in her rooms for hours, staring out the window, muttering to herself, talking about them, about her sister, saying she could hear her footsteps in the halls. She became convinced that Dorothea was still alive. Poirot's eyes narrowed, and Ariadne leaned in, eager to hear more. "The doctors said it was just nerves," the housekeeper continued, her voice lowering to a whisper. "But there was something off. Margaret was afraid of something, or someone." Poirot's instincts flared, his mind already connecting the dots. A twin who might have been forgotten, a woman who grew paranoid, and strange sounds that suggested a presence far more dangerous than simple insanity. Was it possible that Margaret Ravenscroft's fear had been justified? Was her death truly a murder-suicide, or was there something more sinister at play? "Thank you, madame," Poirot said, his voice smooth but with an edge that hinted at the tension beneath. "But we will need to speak to others. There are still many questions left unanswered." As they left the drawing room and wandered deeper into the mansion, a new revelation began to form. The house, silent as it was, held its own version of the truth hidden in corners, sealed away in forgotten rooms. But would Poirot find it before it was too late? They moved toward the library, where the next part of the puzzle was waiting. As they opened the heavy wooden door, the faintest sound, a rustle of paper, reached their ears. Poirot turned quickly, his eyes catching the gleam of something on a dusty shelf. It was a letter, one that had clearly been moved recently, yet its presence here was utterly out of place. Before he could reach for it, a loud crash from the floor above echoed through the mansion, followed by a scream that made Ariadne freeze. Poirot's eyes flashed with realization. The truth was close, too close, and someone was desperate to stop them from finding it. Cliffhanger. Poirot's hand hovered over the letter, but before he could grab it, the scream echoed again, this time louder, more frantic. Someone was in danger, and the clock was ticking. In the dim light of a late afternoon, Poirot found himself seated in the somber parlor of the Ravenscroft family homia room that, despite its faded elegance, exuded an aura of lingering sorrow and secrets. The faded wallpaper, patterned with delicate roses and vines, now bore the weight of untold memories, each crease a silent witness to the past. Across from him sat Celia Ravenscroft, the only living remnant of a once proud lineage. Her eyes, a pale echo of her mother's, darted nervously about the room. Clutched in her trembling hands was a small worn locket, relic from a happier time, perhaps now serving as her only shield against the oppressive memories of her parents' tragic end. "Miss Ravenscroft," Poirot began softly, his voice measured and gentle. "I understand that the events surrounding your parents have left you deeply troubled. Perhaps you might share your recollections with me." Celia's gaze fell to the locket, and for a long moment she remained silent. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "I have spent my entire life living in the shadow of that dreadful night. There was always an undercurrent, a secret I couldn't quite grasp." Her fingers caressed the locket as though seeking comfort from its familiar weight. Poirot's keen eyes never left hers. "A secret, you say? I wonder if you might elaborate further." He leaned forward, his tone both inviting and probing, as if coaxing a reluctant confession from a hidden well of memories. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she hesitated, then spoke in a fractured cadence. "My mother, Margaret, was never the same after that night. I remember her eyes, wide with fear, as though she was haunted by a presence that only she could see. And my father, General Ravenscroft, was consumed by duty, his demeanor cold, distant, as if he was always fighting an enemy that lurked in the periphery of his thoughts." Her voice broke, and she clutched the locket closer, as if it might somehow contain the truth. Poirot noted every quiver in her voice, every subtle shift in her expression. "And did you ever hear anything unusual before the tragedy took hold?" he inquired, the quiet intensity of his words sharpening the atmosphere. Celia's gaze flickered to the darkened corner of the room, as if the shadows themselves held the answer. "There were whispers, Monsieur Poirot," she confessed, her voice low and laden with dread. "At night, I would sometimes hear a soft, almost indistinguishable laughter coming from the corridors. I believed it to be my imagination at first, but later I began to wonder, could it be that something else was there, something I was never meant to understand?" As she spoke, a sudden chill swept through the room, and the wind outside howled as if echoing her hidden terror. Poirot leaned back, his mind piecing together the fragments of her recollections with the larger tapestry of the Ravenscroft mystery. Her testimony hinted at something deeper, a secret that had been shrouded in silence, waiting to be unearthed. Just then, as if on cue, a soft knock sounded at the door of the parlor. Celia's eyes widened in alarm, and she hesitated as if fearing what or who might be on the other side. Poirot exchanged a brief, knowing glance with her. In that moment, the air grew thick with anticipation, as though the walls themselves were conspiring to reveal the next piece of the puzzle. "Who could it be at this hour?" Celia murmured, her voice trembling with both curiosity and dread. Poirot rose slowly, his impeccable manner belying the storm of thoughts swirling within him. "We shall see, mademoiselle," he replied softly, his tone promising both caution and revelation. He moved toward the door, each step measured, while Celia's anxious eyes followed him, a mixture of hope and fear dancing in their depths. As Poirot reached for the door handle, The knock came again, firmer this time, as if the visitor was impatient. With a final lingering glance back at Celia, he whispered, "The truth, it seems, is knocking at our door." And with that, the door creaked open, leaving both Poirot and Celia on the precipice of another revelation that promised to unravel further the tangled web of mystery surrounding the Ravenscrofts, and perhaps expose secrets too dangerous to be kept hidden. Cliffhanger. Who stood on the threshold, a long-forgotten figure from the past, or a stranger with ties to a truth that Celia had so desperately tried to forget? The answer lay just beyond the door, waiting to plunge them deeper into the enigma of the Ravenscroft legacy. The next day, Poirot and Ariadne made their way to Major Hector Blunt's estate. The soldier's home was tucked away at the edge of the town, on a stretch of land that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The house, while imposing, stood stark against the overcast sky, its sharp angles and faded grandeur mirroring the man at Howe's stoic, unyielding, and wrapped in layers of restraint. Major Blunt, a man whose presence could silence a room, greeted them at the door with the practiced courtesy of a soldier who had long since traded in camaraderie for distance. His sharp eyes, cold and calculating, took in Poirot and Ariadne as they entered, but it was his silences, deliberate lack of words, that spoke volumes. The very air seemed to press in on them, thick with unspoken tension. Poirot wasted no time. "Major Blunt," he said, his voice steady yet probing, "you and General Ravenscroft were close, yes, a relationship forged in service and camaraderie." Blunt's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting toward the window as if something just beyond the glass demanded his attention. For a moment, he seemed a man lost in thought, haunted perhaps by memories he could not or would not share. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low and measured. "We served together," Blunt said, his eyes narrowing. The general was a man of duty, nothing more, nothing less. His wife, on the other hand, well, that was a different story. Poirot's keen eyes never wavered. "And what of the tragic night? The deaths of the Ravenscrofts? Do you have any insight? Any detail that might illuminate what truly happened?" Blunt's expression darkened, and for a split second, a flicker of unease crossed his features. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. "I'm afraid my memory isn't as sharp as it used to be," he said, the words carrying an edge of finality, as though he was closing a door that had been opened too many times. But Poirot wasn't so easily deterred. "Of course, Major. But tell me, what was the nature of the general's relationship with his wife? Was there any tension between them in the days leading up to that night?" Blunt hesitated, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. Then, in a voice tinged with bitterness, he muttered, "The general was burdened, haunted, if you will. The war had done things to him, things no man should have to carry. Margaret, his wife, she tried. God knows she tried to understand. But the pressure, it broke something inside him. And Margaret, she was never the same after the war, always looking over her shoulder, like there was something waiting to pounce." Poirot absorbed his words carefully, noting every subtle shift in Blunt's demeanor, every slight change in the tone of his voice. There was more here, more than Blunt was willing to admit. As they left Major Blunt's estate, Poirot's mind was whirling, every clue weaving itself into a pattern he was only beginning to understand. But there was more to be learned. They needed another perspective, someone who had been on the periphery of it all, watching from the sidelines. Mrs. Buckley, the local neighbor, had a reputation for knowing everyone's business. She had lived next door to the Ravenscrofts for years, and by all accounts, had seen more than her fair share of things she should not have. The perfect person to ask, Poirot mused, though he could sense a shrewdness behind her eyes that made him cautious. As they arrived at Mrs. Buckley's home, it became clear that she was not one to welcome visitors lightly. The small cottage stood at the edge of the village, its windows darkened with heavy curtains. A faint scent of old books and dust lingered in the air, and the garden, once tidy and cared for, now appeared wild and untamed, much like its owner. Mrs. Buckley opened the door with a thin smile, her eyes gleaming with a kind of knowingness that made the hairs on the back of Poirot's neck stand on end. "I've been expecting you, Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice soft yet sharp, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "You want to hear what I know about the Ravenscrofts, and believe me, I know plenty." Ariadne shot a quick glance at Poirot, her curiosity piqued. Poirot, however, remained composed, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied Mrs. Buckley. "Indeed, madam, you have lived here for many years, and as I understand it, you remember everything." Mrs. Buckley chuckled a low, throaty laugh that sent a chill down Ariadne's spine. "Oh, I do. I remember the way the house used to echo with laughter before it all went dark. How Margaret's laughter would fill the halls, and the General's voice, so commanding, so full of life." She paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing, and then added with a smirk, "But there were whispers too, Mr. Poirot. Whispers in the night that no one wanted to acknowledge. And I remember who was there the night everything changed." Poirot's gaze sharpened, his attention fully fixed on Mrs. Buckley. "Who, madam? Who was there?" Mrs. Buckley leaned in, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "It was Blunt. Major Blunt. He never left that night. I saw him his shadow moving in the dark. And after that, the house, well, let's just say it was never the same." Her words hung in the air like a poisoned chalice, both a revelation and a warning. Poirot's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her statement, each word carrying weight and suspicion. Just as Poirot opened his mouth to ask more, the door behind Mrs. Buckley creaked. A shadow passed by the window, casting a fleeting, almost imperceptible movement across the room. Mrs. Buckley's eyes flickered to the door, her smile vanishing. "Ah," she whispered, "it seems someone else wishes to join our conversation." The door swung open, and standing there, silhouetted in the doorway, was someone Poirot had never expected to see again. Cliffhanger. Who stood at the threshold? A figure from the past, or someone more sinister, with ties to the Ravenscroft mystery that Poirot had yet to uncover? The answer, poised just on the other side of that door, promised to change everything. Poirot and Ariadne made their way through the mist-covered streets of the small village, the heavy fog clinging to the cobblestones beneath their feet. The tension in the air seemed almost palpable as they approached their next stop, the home of Dr. Willoughby, the Ravenscrofts' trusted family physician. Dr. Willoughby's house stood at the far edge of the village, its tall stone walls looming like a watchful sentinel. A single light flickered in the window, casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow pathway leading to the front door. It was a house that seemed to carry secrets in every corner, as if the very walls themselves held their breath, waiting to reveal something dark and hidden. When they rang the doorbell, the sound echoed through the stillness, sharp and urgent. A moment passed, and then the door creaked open with unsettling slowness, revealing the doctor himself. His appearance was exactly as Ariadne remembered, tall, with a gaunt face and piercing eyes that always seemed to observe more than they let on. He wore a long, dark coat that seemed to blend with the shadows, and his expression was unreadable, too calm for a man who was about to be questioned about the deaths of his longtime patients. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, doctor," Willoughby said, his voice smooth and composed, though there was a flicker of something else, something fleeting in his eyes. "And Miss Oliver, what brings you to my humble abode on such a night?" Poirot stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the doctor's face. "We are investigating the deaths of General Ravenscroft and his wife, Margaret. You were, as I understand, the family physician. I am sure you recall their final days very well." Ariadne watched as Dr. Willoughby's face tightened ever so slightly, his lips pressing together in a thin line. For a moment, the doctor seemed to contemplate his response, and Poirot could feel the weight of his hesitation in the air. "Yes," Dr. Willoughby said finally, his voice even, betraying none of the turmoil that was surely brewing beneath the surface. "I remember them well. The Ravenscrofts were a troubled family, Monsieur Poirot. But then, aren't we all troubled in some way?" He gave a small, unsettling smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Poirot, ever sharp, didn't miss the subtle shift in the doctor's demeanor. "Troubled? In what way?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, a glint of suspicion hidden beneath his calm tone. Dr. Willoughby seemed to consider this question for a moment, his eyes briefly flicking toward the shadows of his home. His gaze returned to Poirot, and he finally spoke, his words heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "General Ravenscroft, he suffered. The war had changed him. I treated him for many years, and I saw the toll it took on his mind and body. But Margaret, she was a different case entirely. She became unwell in a way that went beyond the ordinary. She had dreams, visions, things she couldn't explain. She would speak of a darkness that haunted her, something lurking in the house." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Visions? And did she tell you what she saw? What did she fear?" Dr. Willoughby hesitated, his fingers absently stroking the edge of the doorframe. His expression grew darker, as though the weight of the memory was suddenly too much to bear. "She never said much, but I know she confided in someone. She wasn't as alone as people thought. I had my suspicions, but as a physician, I am bound by confidentiality." His voice dropped to a near whisper. But there was more to Margaret's death than anyone realized. More than the public was ever told. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his instincts telling him that the good doctor was holding back. "What do you mean more? Did you have a reason to suspect foul play?" Dr. Willoughby's face remained carefully composed, but his gaze faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough to suggest a deep, hidden truth. "I am a man of science, Monsieur Poirot. I trust in evidence, not speculation. But when I performed the autopsy on Margaret, I found something unusual, a trace of poison, a rare, almost undetectable toxin." The words hit like a blow. Poison, a rare toxin. It couldn't be a coincidence. The silence in the room deepened, as though the very air had thickened with the weight of his revelation. Poirot's mind raced. The implications of this discovery were immense. Was Margaret murdered, or had she taken her own life, as some had suspected? And if poison had been involved, where had it come from? Was it connected to the general's death, or was someone else pulling the strings, someone with access to the Ravenscroft household? You never mentioned this before," Poirot said, his voice steady but his mind turning over the new information like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. "Why now? Why tell us this now?" Dr. Willoughby's eyes flickered with something regret, perhaps, or was it fear? He took a step back, the door creaking on its hinges, as though it were reluctant to let them in any further. "Because," he said softly, "I have been waiting for someone like you, Monsieur Poirot. Someone who will see what I have been hiding all these years. Someone who will uncover the truth. And perhaps in doing so, we will all be forced to confront what really happened that night." Just as Poirot opened his mouth to probe further, a sharp noise echoed from within the house, an unmistakable sound, the unmistakable click of a door closing. Ariadne turned, startled, but Dr. Willoughby's expression didn't change. He simply smiled, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I believe that is your answer," he said, his voice tinged with something darker now. "The truth lies just beyond that door. But be warned, Monsieur Poirot, some doors, once opened, should never be closed again." The door behind him creaked open, revealing a shadowed hallway, its end obscured by darkness. Cliffhanger. What awaited them down the hallway? A hidden room, a secret that had been locked away for years. And would they be able to uncover the final piece of the Ravenscroft mystery before it consumed them all? The moment stood on the edge of revelation, and Poirot knew one thing for certain: was about to be drawn into a web far more tangled than he ever expected. The night had deepened, and the wind outside seemed to howl with an eerie intensity as Poirot and Ariadne made their way back to the Ravenscroft estate. The estate loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the darkening sky. Each step they took brought them closer to the truth, but the closer they came, the more elusive the answers seemed to be. Poirot's mind was racing. The web of lies, secrets, and half-truths surrounding the Ravenscroft family was growing more tangled by the hour. As he and Ariadne entered the drawing room, the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with the weight of what had already been revealed and the far greater mystery still to be unraveled. The suspects had been carefully scrutinized, each one seeming to hide something just out of reach, as though they were all holding onto fragments of the truth, fragments that didn't quite fit together. The first to speak was Celia Ravenscroft. The once vibrant daughter of the general and Margaret had withered under the weight of her own guilt and fear. Now, she was nothing more than a nervous shell of the young woman she had been. She sat stiffly in a chair near the fire, her eyes darting around the room, never meeting Poirot's gaze for more than a fleeting second. "I never meant for any of it to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My parents were. They were never the same after the war. After my father came back, he changed." Her words hung in the air, thick with unspoken emotion, but Poirot could sense the contradictions in her tone. There was something in her eyes, something hidden. A lie, or perhaps a fear of something far worse than she dared admit. Poirot studied her, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. "You were close to them, yes. To your mother, to your father. And yet, you speak as though you were distant from the tragedy that unfolded. Why is that, Mademoiselle Ravenscroft?" Celia's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she lowered her head, clasping her hands tightly together. The tension in the room was palpable, but before Poirot could press further, the door creaked open and in walked Major Hector, blunt, rigid, and stern, like a man who had long since buried his emotions under a mask of stoic indifference. His presence seemed to fill the room, and yet there was an unsettling emptiness in his gaze. A man of war, but one who carried more than the scars of battle. "I told you before, Poirot," Blunt said, his voice gruff. "There's nothing more to say. The general was my friend. We served together in the trenches. And after the war, well, we all tried to move on, didn't we?" His tone was sharp, but there was a flicker of something darker, guilt, or perhaps shame. Poirot leaned forward slightly, sensing the unsaid words hanging in the air like an unsolved riddle. "And yet," Poirot pressed, "you are here. You wish to ensure the truth is uncovered, yes? Or is it simply your own conscience that demands it?" Blunt stiffened, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Poirot thought he would say more, but then the man turned away, his face hidden in the shadows. "Conscience," Blunt muttered. "Sometimes the truth is better left buried." Ariadne glanced at Poirot, her brow furrowed in confusion. But before she could speak, Mrs. Buckley, the ever watchful, ever curious neighbor, stepped into the room with her usual air of unwelcome intrusion. Her sharp eyes were always alert, always calculating, as though she were constantly watching, always searching for that one detail that might slip through the cracks. "I remember everything, you know," Mrs. Buckley said, her voice thin and brittle, like the crackling fire. "Everything that happened that night, the laughter, the screams, the way the house seemed to hold its breath. But there's one thing I can't forget. The way Margaret Ravenscroft looked just before she paused, as if realizing she had nearly said too much. Well, it doesn't matter, does it? The truth is already out there, buried in the past." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And you believe you know the truth, Mrs. Buckley? Or is it merely the rumors that you have clung to?" She smiled, a smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "Oh, I know more than I should, Monsieur Poirot. I've seen things, heard things, things that no one else would believe." Her voice trailed off, leaving a lingering sense of unease in its wake. Poirot stood up slowly, his thoughts spinning. Each of them, Celia, Blunt, Mrs. Buckley, was hiding something. They spoke of the past, but their words were laced with contradictions. And then there was Dr. Willoughby, whose medical expertise had provided a chilling new clue: poison, a rare toxin. But how far did the doctor's involvement truly go? Was he simply a physician bound by his oath, or was he more deeply entangled in the Ravenscroft tragedy than anyone dared imagine? As Poirot turned back to face the group, his mind raced through the possibilities. Nothing was adding up. Each of them held a piece of the puzzle, but none seemed trustworthy enough to offer a complete picture. They were all keeping secrets, afraid of what the truth might reveal. And then, just as Poirot was about to speak, there came a soft knock at the door. It was a quiet sound, but it sent a ripple of tension through the room. The door opened, and in stepped a shadowy figure, draped in a cloak so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure's face was hidden, but the air in the room shifted, as if something or someone had entered who was not meant to be there. The figure stepped forward slowly, and Poirot's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary visitor. The weight of their presence felt like an omen. Cliffhanger. Who was this mysterious figure? Was it someone from the past, or had the truth finally come to claim its due? As the figure's footsteps echoed in the silence, Poirot knew that this was the moment everything would change. The final piece of the puzzle was about to be revealed, and the revelation would change everything. The air in the Ravenscroft estate had become thick with secrets, each room steeped in the echoes of a past that no one seemed willing to fully confront. Poirot and Ariadne stood in the dimly lit library, the faint smell of aged paper and dust hanging in the air. Poirot had just discovered a hidden compartment in the oak bookshelf, a secret drawer that had escaped the notice of generations. Inside it, wrapped in a delicate velvet cloth, lay a diary, Margaret Ravenscroft's diary. Ariadne, her curiosity piqued, leaned over Poirot's shoulder, watching as he carefully flipped through the pages. The handwriting was elegant, the ink fading in places, but the words seemed to pulse with an unsettling urgency. Poirot's fingers paused on a particular entry, and his eyes darkened as he read aloud. "I fear Dorothea is no longer a memory. She is here. She watches, waits, and she will not stop until she has what she believes is hers. I do not know if I can escape. Hirsch is too strong, too determined. My heart races, my thoughts betray me, and I wonder, has she come back to finish what she started?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Ariadne's breath caught in her throat as she looked at Poirot, who appeared to be deep in thought, his brow furrowed with the weight of this new revelation. Margaret had a twin, Dorothea twin, who had been presumed dead after a mysterious disappearance years ago. But now the diary hinted at something far more chilling. Dorothea might have returned. The twin, long thought to be gone, might have been lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Poirot closed the diary gently, his mind racing with the implications. Dorothea's return explained much the eerie atmosphere surrounding the Ravenscroft estate, the paranoia that had plagued Margaret before her death, the whispers in the halls that no one could explain. Dorothea wasn't a mere ghost of the past. She was very real and very dangerous. Ariadne took a step back, her mind reeling from the discovery. But why would Margaret hide this? Why keep it a secret for so long? Poirot's gaze was distant, focused on a point beyond the room. "Because, mademoiselle, some truths are too terrifying to face, and sometimes it is better to let the past remain buried." His voice was heavy with the weight of his own experience with such cases. He had seen how easily the past could bleed into the present, how dangerous it could be when old wounds were reopened. Suddenly, a sharp, jarring sound broke the tension, the crash of glass shattering somewhere in the house. Ariadne's eyes widened, and before she could say anything, Poirot was already moving, his instinctual sharpness taking over. He gestured for her to stay back, and followed the sound of the breaking glass down a narrow hallway that led to a rear terrace. The scene they encountered was nothing short of a nightmare. Ariadne was lying on the ground, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead where a shard of glass had struck her. She had been standing by the open terrace window, looking out over the estate, when the window exploded outward, as if someone had thrown a heavy object into it. Poirot dropped to his knees beside her, his heart pounding in his chest as he checked for signs of life. She was breathing, but unconscious, her pulse faint. "Ariadne," he called softly, but she didn't respond. The sight of her lying motionless sent a chill through him. This wasn't just an accident. It was a message, a warning. Poirot's mind whirled as he stood up, surveying the scene. The broken glass scattered across the terrace, the gaping hole in the window, and the faintest trace of movement outside in the shadow. Something was amiss. He glanced back at Ariadne's still form, feeling a surge of protectiveness, but he knew that whatever this was, it had just escalated to a far more dangerous level. He had to act. This was no longer just a case of a forgotten family tragedy. This was a fight against something far darker. Someone was trying to prevent him from uncovering the truth, and the attempt on Ariadne's life made it all too clear that they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. Poirot rushed to the window, his eyes scanning the grounds below. The estate was sprawling, its vast garden and estate walls providing plenty of places for someone to hide. His mind raced through the possibilities, but one thing was certain. Dorothea's return had set something into motion, something that no one in the Ravenscroft family had prepared for. And then, as Poirot turned to leave the terrace, he heard a faint, distant voice, a whisper carried on the wind, or perhaps it was his imagination. But it sounded like a name, Margaret. And it was followed by a single chilling sentence: "I will finish what she started." Poirot froze, the weight of the words sinking in like a stone. Was this Dorothea speaking, or was it someone else? The danger was closing in, and Poirot knew that time was running out. The killer was still out there, hiding in plain sight, and they were willing to go to any lengths to protect their twisted legacy. Cliffhanger. With Ariadne's life hanging in the balance, and a new threat emerging from the shadows, Poirot knew that every step forward would bring him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to uncover. But he had no choice. The game had changed, and he was in it now, whether he liked it or not. What was Dorothea's ultimate plan? And would Poirot be able to stop her before it was too late? The wind howled outside the Ravenscroft mansion, the once grand house now standing like a silent sentinel to the twisted secrets it had kept buried for years. Inside, Poirot had gathered the key players of the mystery, each one unknowingly stepping into a trap set with precision and care. The tension in the room was palpable as Poirot stood at the center, his sharp eyes scanning each of them as if measuring their every breath. Ariadne had recovered, though the shadows of what had happened still clung to her. She sat beside Poirot, her eyes filled with an unspoken question, a mix of fear and curiosity, as they waited for the revelations that would shake them all to the core. The house was dimly lit, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere thick with dread. Poirot's voice broke the silence, calm and deliberate, yet carrying the weight of years of deception. "You have all been living with a lie," he began, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The murder of General Ravenscroft and his wife Margaret was never what it seemed. There was no murder, suicide. The truth, my friends, is far darker. He paused for a moment, watching as each of them processed the weight of his words. There was a collective shift in the room: anxiety, suspicion, disbelief. Poirot stepped forward, his gaze landing on Celia Ravenscroft, whose eyes widened with a mix of terror and recognition. "Celia," Poirot said softly, "do you remember your mother's twin sister, Dorothea?" Celia's breath caught in her throat. But Dorothea died years ago," she stammered, her voice shaking. She drowned in the lake, we were told." Poirot nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That is what you were told, but the truth is far more complicated. Dorothea did not drown. She survived, and for years she watched, she waited. And when the time came, she took on a new identity, Margaret's." The room seemed to close in around them as Poirot's words sank in. Celia's face went pale, her eyes flickering with confusion and disbelief. "Number that can't be true. It would have been impossible to impersonate her all those years." Her voice trailed off, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what Poirot was suggesting. Poirot's gaze sharpened. It was not impossible. Dorothea was driven by a deep-seated need for control, and her mind, unstable as it was willing to do anything to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. Ariadne, who had been silently absorbing the scene, finally spoke. "But if Dorothea was alive all this time, why did she kill Margaret? Why not just claim her place?" Poirot's eyes darkened as he turned toward her. Because Dorothea was not just a woman consumed by jealousy, she was a woman tortured by her own demons. The confrontation between Margaret and Dorothea was not just one of rivalry, it was a violent clash of fractured minds. Margaret, realizing what had happened, tried to confront her sister. But Dorothea, in her madness, could not allow the truth to surface. The weight of Poirot's words hung in the air, as everyone in the room processed the harrowing implications. But Poirot wasn't done yet. He moved toward the fireplace, where the flames flickered menacingly, casting shadows that seemed to dance like specters of the past. The tragedy that followed Margaret's death, General Ravenscroft's subsequent grief, was not the end of the story. The final twist is far more insidious. Turning to face them all, Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper. General Ravenscroft, in his guilt and desperation, sought to cover up the truth. He knew Dorothea was alive, and when he discovered that Margaret had confronted her, he acted quickly to protect his family's reputation. He did not want to expose the truth that his beloved wife had been murdered by her own twin. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, each person in the room reeling from the impact. Major Hector Blunt's face turned ashen, while Mrs. Buckley gasped, her hand fluttering to her throat. The only one who seemed unaffected was Dr. Willoughby, whose face remained unreadable, his eyes betraying nothing. Poirot stepped closer to Celia, his eyes softening with a hint of empathy. Your father, Celia, did not want you to know the truth. He wanted to protect you from the horror of it all. But now, the past has caught up with us, and there is no escaping the truth. Celia's hands trembled as she pressed them to her chest. But why? Why now? Why reveal this after all these years? Poirot gave a small, rueful smile. Because, mademoiselle, the dead do not stay silent forever, and someone has gone to great lengths to keep this secret buried. He turned toward the window, the storm outside reflecting the chaos within. There are some who would do anything to keep the truth from coming to light. A sudden sound footsteps broke the air, and Poirot's instincts kicked in. The door to the mansion creaked open, and in the doorway stood a figure, tall and cloaked in shadows, their face hidden. Poirot's gaze locked onto the figure, his heart pounding with a mix of certainty and dread. The game was far from over. The final piece of the puzzle had yet to fall into place. Cliffhanger ending. As the figure stepped forward, a voice echoed through the room, low, familiar, and laced with venom. You think you know everything, Poirot. You think you've uncovered the truth. You're wrong. This story isn't over. Not by a long shot. The room fell into a stunned, suffocating silence as Poirot stood, his eyes narrowed and intense, fixed on the one person in the room who had been playing the game from the very start. Every corner of the Ravenscroft mansion seemed to hold its breath, as if even the walls were aware that the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. Poirot's finger slowly raised, pointing directly at Dr. Willoughby, who had remained eerily calm throughout the gathering, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His expression was one of practiced indifference, as though he had heard nothing of the storm Poirot had just unleashed. The doctor's eyes flickered for the briefest moment, just a flicker, but it was enough. Enough for Poirot to see it, enough to unravel the entire carefully crafted facade. Dr. Willoughby, Poirot said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of years of deception. You are the one who has pulled all the strings. You are the mastermind behind this twisted tale. It was you who manipulated Dorothea's fragile mind, who fed her delusions and gave her the push she needed to destroy her own sister, all for your gain. The words hit the room like a clap of thunder, and for a moment no one spoke. The housekeeper, Mrs. Buckley, gasped, clutching her pearls as her eyes darted between Poirot and Dr. Willoughby. Major Blunt stiffened, his face pale, while Celia's hands trembled, her breath catching in her throat. Ariadne, ever perceptive, leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and understanding. Dr. Willoughby's face, for the first time, flickered, a quick flash of something, perhaps, or was it a deeper, more sinister emotion? It was gone almost instantly, replaced by his usual calm exterior. He smiled, though it was the smile of a man who knew he was in control of the situation, even in the face of Poirot's accusation. Poirot, Dr. Willoughby said smoothly, his voice like silk, though it held an edge of warning. You've built a marvelous story, but it's all conjecture. You have no evidence, no proof to back up your claims. Poirot's lips curled into a knowing smile, his eyes never leaving Dr. Willoughby's. Ah, "But that is where you are mistaken, my friend," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I have all the proof I need." He reached into his coat pocket, slowly pulling out a small weathered notebook. It was Margaret's diary, but there was more to it now, more than just a simple confession from a desperate woman. Inside, Poirot had found more than he had ever expected. This, Poirot said, his finger resting lightly on the diary, was not merely the musings of a troubled woman. It contained something far more important, something you thought would remain hidden forever. It contains a letter, written by Dorothea herself, addressed to none other than you, Dr. Willoughby. Poirot paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with anticipation. A sharp intake of breath echoed from Celia, as she looked from Poirot to the doctor, her eyes wide with disbelief. Dr. Willoughby's face remained unmoved, but the tension in his jaw was undeniable. Poirot continued, unflinching. "The letter reveals everything," Poirot said, turning the diary over so that the pages rustled in the quiet room. "Dorothea was not the mastermind number. She was merely the instrument, the puppet in your twisted game. You manipulated her every thought, feeding her lies about Margaret, about her own identity. You made her believe she was the rightful heir to the Ravenscroft legacy. But all you cared about was the power you could gain by controlling the estate." Dr. Willoughby's eyes narrowed, and his hands clenched at his sides. The calm facade was starting to crack. "You know nothing of what you speak," he growled, the venom now clear in his voice. Poirot, ever the calm and precise detective, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "You were not just the family's physician, Dr. Willoughby. You were a man who saw an opportunity in madness. You preyed on Dorothea's fragile psyche, and when she tried to kill Margaret, you helped cover it up. You made sure the truth remained hidden, because if the truth came out, your empire would crumble." The room seemed to tighten, the air thick with disbelief and dread. The others stood frozen, unable to comprehend the magnitude of Poirot's words. But Dr. Willoughby was no longer pretending to be a doctor or a man of calm reason. His mask had shattered, and his true self emerged cold, calculating, and ruthless. "You think you have everything figured out, Poirot," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You think you can expose me, unravel my plan. You're wrong. The game isn't over yet." A sharp noise, something heavy falling to the floor, snapped the room to attention. Dr. Willoughby took a sudden step backward, his eyes darting toward the window, where the faintest shadow could be seen outside, watching. The storm raged outside, the wind howling against the walls, as if the world itself was closing in. Poirot's face tightened. He was aware now that the game was far from finished. But in that instant, as Dr. Willoughby's eyes flickered with a newfound, dangerous determination, Poirot knew. This wasn't just a fight for truth, it was a battle for survival. Cliffhanger ending. With a final, chilling laugh, Dr. Willoughby turned and bolted for the door, disappearing into the night, leaving Poirot and the others in stunned silence. But the sound of his retreating footsteps echoed in their minds, a grim reminder that the darkness of Ravenscroft's past had not yet released its hold. The game was far from over. The air was thick with a biting chill, as Poirot and Ariadne stood at the gates of Ravenscroft Mansion, the heavy wooden doors now firmly shut behind them. The mansion, once a symbol of dark mysteries and twisted secrets, stood silent in the fading light of the evening, as though it had exhaled a long-held breath and finally found peace. But for Poirot, the air was still filled with the lingering weight of everything that had unfolded, everything that had been revealed, and everything that had yet to be uncovered. Ariadne, her expression still tense from the whirlwind of events that had shaken their very souls, glanced over at Poirot. Her voice, soft but steady, broke the silence. "Do you believe it's truly over then, Hercule?" Poirot, ever the calm and composed figure, stood motionless for a long moment, his gaze fixed ahead. The once brilliant detective, whose mind had worked through the knots of countless cases, now seemed deep in thought, as if the shadow of Ravenscroft's secrets was still cast over him. "No, madame," Poirot said finally, his voice quiet, but sharp like a fine blade. "The case has been solved, yes. the truth revealed. But the heart, you see, it is a different matter altogether. The heart does not easily relinquish its secrets, not even to time. Ariadne tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. You're saying the answers we uncovered were only part of the story. Poirot's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, a touch of sadness in his eyes, as he turned to face her. It is a truth that is often overlooked. The mind, yes, the mind can decipher logic, uncover facts, and expose the hidden motives that lead to tragedy. But the heart, the heart, is a far more elusive thing. It holds its own secrets, its own betrayals, its own passions, that even the passage of time cannot erase. Ariadne felt a shiver pass through her. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that Poirot was not simply reflecting on the case, but on something far deeper. His words, so often precise, now seemed veiled in an unsettling truth. She wanted to ask him more, to probe further. But something about the finality in his tone told her that some mysteries like the ones that lay hidden in the hearts of men were not meant to be uncovered. Not yet. As they reached the edge of the town, the distant hum of life fading into the distance, Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the darkened silhouette of the Ravenscroft mansion, now barely visible against the encroaching night. Perhaps, madame, it is the very nature of secrets, Poirot continued, as though he were speaking to himself, that they never truly die. They simply wait. And when the time is right, they return with a vengeance. The finality of his words seemed to hang in the air, unspoken yet understood, as they made their way toward the quiet town below. Just as they turned the corner, something caught Poirot's sharp eye. A small piece of paper, fluttering in the breeze near the foot of a lamppost. His instincts kicked in before his mind could register what it was, and with a quick motion, he bent to pick it up. Ariane glanced at him, puzzled. "What is it, Poirot?" Poirot unfurled the piece of paper, his eyes narrowing in the dimming light. A single, hastily written sentence was scrawled across it in a hurried, erratic hand. "The heart never forgets. Neither should you." Poirot stood frozen, the paper crinkling softly in his hands, his mind already racing. As the weight of the message settled in, it was a warning, a reminder. The game, it seemed, was not over. And this time there would be no escape from the shadows that had once again begun to stir. Cliffhanger ending. As the wind picked up, rustling the trees around them, Poirot slipped the paper into his coat pocket, his gaze intense and unwavering. "No, madame," he whispered softly, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "The heart does not forget, and this mystery is far from finished." And with that, the last traces of daylight vanished, leaving them in the shadows, with the knowledge that whatever lay ahead was something even darker and more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. "Can you solve the case before Poirot?"